When Sarah Jenkins married David Thompson, she thought she had finally found happiness. They had just started their honeymoon, a time meant for love and celebration. But no one knew that within just a few days, Sarah would make a shocking discovery that would change everything. What started as a romantic getaway would soon end in a tragedy no one could have predicted. David had a secret, one so dark and dangerous that when Sarah found out, it led to a deadly confrontation. The honeymoon turned into a nightmare, leaving everyone around them stunned and searching for answers. David was a man who seemed perfect, charming, kind, and successful. But behind the smiles and sweet words, he was hiding something that would lead to his own death. On the surface, everything looked fine, but underneath, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, with deadly consequences. In this story, we'll look at how a new marriage turned into a terrible crime, where love quickly became fear, and trust was broken in the worst way possible. The events that followed shocked everyone and left Sarah facing a decision that no one should ever have to make. What happens when the person you trust the most is not who they say they are? How far will someone go to protect themselves when they feel trapped and betrayed? Sarah's story is one of fear, betrayal, and murder, a crime that shocked everyone who knew the couple. Stay with us as we explore the chilling details of how Sarah's honeymoon turned into a nightmare, leading to a crime no one saw coming. Sarah Jenkins was a 30-year-old woman who had just married David Thompson, a 35-year-old man who seemed perfect in every way. The couple had met a little over a year ago, and their relationship had moved quickly. David was charming, successful, and seemed to genuinely care for Sarah. After a whirlwind romance, they decided to get married and head off on their honeymoon, a trip to a beautiful coastal resort. The first few days of their honeymoon were everything Sarah had dreamed of. The ocean was calm, the skies were clear, and David seemed to be the perfect husband. They spent their days walking on the beach, enjoying romantic dinners, and talking about their future together. But as the week went on, Sarah started to notice small things about David that didn't quite add up. At first, it was just little details like the way he would check his phone constantly or disappear for short periods of time without telling her where he was going. Sarah brushed it off, not wanting to ruin their honeymoon with doubts. But as the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. David's behavior became more secretive. He would leave their hotel room at odd hours, always coming back with a vague excuse. Sarah asked him a few times what was going on, but David would just smile and tell her not to worry. She wanted to believe him, but something deep inside her told her that David was hiding something. One night, while David was asleep, Sarah noticed his phone light up on the bedside table. Curiosity got the better of her, and she picked it up to check the message. What she saw made her stomach drop. There were dozens of messages from an unknown number, all asking David where he was and when he would be back. The messages were frantic, full of concern and urgency. It was clear that whoever was texting him wasn't just a friend or a colleague. Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled through the messages, trying to make sense of what was happening. She wanted to confront David right then and there, but she hesitated. If she woke him up and started asking questions, would he get angry? Would he lie to her? Sarah decided to wait until the morning to see if David would explain things on his own. But as the hours passed, she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Who was texting David? Why hadn't he mentioned anything about this person? Was he hiding something more serious than she had ever imagined? The next morning, Sarah tried to act normal, hoping David would bring up whatever was going on. But he didn't. Instead, he acted as if nothing had happened, laughing and joking like everything was fine. Sarah's anxiety grew with each passing hour. She couldn't keep quiet any longer. After breakfast, as they were walking on the beach, Sarah turned to David and asked him directly about the messages. David's face changed immediately. The warm, loving smile he had worn all morning disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Sarah as if he couldn't believe she had brought it up. When he finally spoke, his words were sharp and defensive. He accused Sarah of snooping, of not trusting him, and of ruining their honeymoon with her accusations. Sarah was taken aback by his reaction. She hadn't expected him to get so angry so quickly. She tried to explain that she wasn't trying to accuse him of anything, that she just wanted to understand what was going on. But David wouldn't listen. He stormed off, leaving Sarah alone on the beach, confused and upset. As she watched him walk away, Sarah realized that something much bigger was going on. David was hiding something, and whatever it was serious enough to make him react this way. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he having an affair? Was he involved in something illegal? The questions swirled in her head, but she had no answers. For the rest of the day, David barely spoke to Sarah. He spent most of his time on his phone, texting or making calls that he quickly ended whenever she walked into the room. The tension between them grew, and by the end of the day, Sarah felt like she didn't even know the man she had just married. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, unable to sleep, she realized she had to find out the truth. She couldn't live with the doubt and suspicion any longer. The honeymoon that had started with so much hope and happiness was quickly turning into a nightmare, and Sarah knew she had to confront David again. But this time she would demand the truth no matter what it was. As Sarah lay awake, planning her next move, she had no idea that the answer she was about to uncover would change everything. The secret David had been hiding was far darker than she could have imagined, and by the time the truth came out, their honeymoon would end in the most tragic way possible. The events that were about to unfold would leave Sarah questioning everything she thought she knew about her new husband and would set the stage for a deadly confrontation that no one could have predicted. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The way David had reacted when she asked about the messages only made her more suspicious. His anger had been intense, almost as if he was trying to hide something bigger than just a few strange texts. The honeymoon, which had started with so much joy, now felt dark and uncertain. Sarah couldn't let it go. She had to know the truth. As the next day unfolded, David tried to act normal, but his behavior seemed forced. He laughed too loudly at small jokes and made an effort to be affectionate, but it felt fake to Sarah. She began paying closer attention to everything he did. Every time David left the room, her heart would race with the thought that he might be up to something. Each time he stepped out of sight, Sarah wondered if he was making secret calls or sending messages she couldn't see. That evening, Sarah found herself alone in the hotel room while David went out for what he said was an errand. She couldn't resist the temptation to search for answers. She began looking through his things, carefully at first, but then with more urgency as her frustration grew. She found nothing in his suitcase or his wallet. Everything looked normal. But then she remembered his laptop. Sarah opened the laptop, hoping to find something that could explain the strange behavior. At first, everything seemed fine: emails, work documents, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, she stumbled upon a hidden folder. Inside were dozens of pictures and videos, all featuring a woman Sarah didn't recognize. The images were intimate, showing David with this woman in different places, some of them from months ago. It was clear that this wasn't just a casual relationship. David had been seeing someone else long before their wedding, and from the looks of it, the relationship was serious. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through the images. The reality of what she was seeing hit her hard. David had been living a double life. He had married her, taken her on a honeymoon, and all the while he had been involved with this other woman. The betrayal was overwhelming. Sarah felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. She had trusted David, but now it was clear that everything he had shown her was a lie. When David returned to the room, Sarah confronted him immediately. She didn't care about his reaction anymore. She demanded to know who the woman was and why he had lied to her. David, caught off guard, didn't deny it. He admitted that he had been seeing the woman for over a year, even while he was planning the wedding with Sarah. He tried to explain it away, saying that the relationship with the other woman didn't mean anything, that it was Sarah he truly loved. But his words felt hollow. Sarah felt her world collapsing. The man she had married wasn't the person she thought he was. The honeymoon that was supposed to be the beginning of their life together had turned into a nightmare. She wanted to scream, to run away, but she was trapped in this situation, stuck in a foreign country with a man she no longer recognized. David's confession didn't end there. As he spoke, more secrets came to light. He wasn't just cheating, he had been using Sarah for her money. David had racked up a significant amount of debt before they met, and marrying Sarah was his way of escaping it. He had carefully planned everything, knowing that once they were married, he could access her wealth. Sarah's heart sank even further. This wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of trust, of everything she believed in. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Sarah couldn't look at David without feeling sick. The anger inside her was building, but she didn't know what to do. She felt trapped, powerless in the face of such an overwhelming betrayal. David, sensing her anger, tried to calm her down, but nothing he said could fix what he had done. The damage was too deep. Sarah left the room, needing space to think. She wandered the hotel grounds, her mind racing. What should she do? She couldn't go back to David, but she couldn't stay in the hotel forever. Her thoughts spiraled as she realized just how alone she was. There was no one she could turn to. She didn't even know where to begin. Meanwhile, back in the room, David began to panic. He hadn't expected things to go this far. He thought he could keep his secrets hidden, but now everything was falling apart. He knew Sarah would leave him, and with her would go the financial security he desperately needed. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, and he began to fear what would happen next. What Sarah didn't know was that this wasn't the first time David had done something like this. His past was full of lies, deceit, and manipulation. He had been involved in similar situations before, always finding a way to use people for his own gain. But this time, things were different. This time, his lies had caught up to him in the worst possible way. As the night wore on, Sarah realized that there was no easy way out. She would have to confront David again, but this time it would be for the last time. The situation was spiraling out of control, and neither of them could see the deadly confrontation that was about to unfold. The secrets David had tried so hard to keep hidden would soon lead to a tragic and violent end. The air in the hotel room was thick with tension. Sarah had returned after hours of walking aimlessly, trying to process the betrayal she had just uncovered. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make sense of what David had done. She had married a man she thought she knew, only to find out that he had been lying to her from the start. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. And now, there was no avoiding the inevitable confrontation. David was sitting on the edge of the bed when Sarah walked back into the room. His expression was a mix of anger and fear. He knew that the conversation they were about to have wasn't going to end well. Sarah sat down across from him, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and sadness. The silence between them felt heavy, each waiting for the other to speak. David tried to explain himself again, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. The lies were too much to bear. Every word he said felt like another betrayal, and Sarah could feel herself getting more and more upset. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she wasn't sure what to do. But one thing was clear: she couldn't stay in this relationship any longer. The argument escalated quickly. David became defensive, accusing Sarah of overreacting, of not understanding his reasons for keeping secrets. But Sarah wasn't interested in his excuses. Her trust had been shattered, and nothing David said could fix it. She stood up, pacing the room, trying to calm herself down, but the betrayal kept replaying in her mind. David, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, grew more desperate. He knew that if Sarah left him, everything he had worked for would fall apart. The money, the security, the lifestyle, everything was slipping through his fingers. His calm demeanor began to crack as the gravity of the situation sank in. He couldn't let Sarah walk away. Not now. As the argument reached its peak, something snapped in David. His desperation turned to anger, and in a sudden, violent moment, he lashed out. The tension that had been building all day exploded in an act of aggression that neither of them could take back. In the heat of the moment, David grabbed Sarah, pushing her back against the wall. The force of the impact shocked Sarah, knocking the wind out of her. For a brief moment, the room was still. Sarah stared at David in disbelief, struggling to catch her breath. She had never imagined that things could escalate to this point. But the look in David's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't the man she had married. This was someone dangerous, someone who had been hiding his true nature all along. Sarah fought back, pushing David away from her as hard as she could. But he was stronger, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. In the chaos that followed, David's anger grew more intense, and he attacked Sarah again, this time with even more force. The struggle between them became violent, with both of them fighting for control. In the midst of the struggle, Sarah grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at David in self-defense. The impact was strong, and David stumbled backward, falling to the ground. Sarah, breathing heavily and filled with adrenaline, stood frozen for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The room was silent again, except for the sound of her own breathing. As she looked down at David, she saw that he wasn't moving. Panic set in as she realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The fight that had started in a moment of anger had ended in a tragic accident. David lay still on the floor, blood pooling around his head from where the lamp had struck him. Sarah's heart raced as she dropped the lamp and rushed to his side, but it was too late. David was dead. The reality of the situation hit Sarah like a wave. She had just killed her husband. The man she had married only days before was now lying dead at her feet, and there was no way to undo what had happened. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she felt like the walls of the room were closing in around her. She couldn't believe what she had done. In a matter of minutes, her life had been completely turned upside down. Sarah stood there, staring at David's lifeless body, unable to move. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Should she call the police? Should she run? Every option seemed impossible, and the weight of what had just happened was crushing her. But as the minutes passed, Sarah knew she couldn't stay there forever. She had to make a decision. Slowly, she backed away from David's body and sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to collect her thoughts. The honeymoon was over. The life she had imagined with David was gone, and now she was left to face the consequences of what had just happened. The tragic end to their relationship had come in the worst possible way. What had started as a marriage built on lies had ended in violence and death. Sarah's world was shattered, and she had no idea how she would ever move forward from this moment. As the night wore on, the reality of what had just happened settled over her like a heavy blanket, and she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. David's lifeless body lay on the floor, a pool of blood slowly spreading around him. The weight of what she had done was crushing. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had never imagined that her life would take such a tragic turn. The honeymoon had turned into a nightmare, and now she was faced with the reality of a murder. She couldn't move for what felt like hours, her eyes fixated on David's body. Panic slowly started to creep in. She knew she had to do something, but what? Call the police? Run? The choices played out in her mind, but none of them seemed like the right answer. How could she explain this? She had killed her husband in a moment of desperation, but would anyone believe it was an accident? As the minutes passed, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculated need to figure out her next steps. Sarah stood up and began pacing the room, trying to calm herself. Her heart was still racing, but she knew she had to think clearly. The first thing she did was lock the door. She didn't want anyone to walk in and see the scene that was now before her. She took a deep breath and looked around the room. There were signs of a struggle: the lamp she had used to strike David, the overturned chair, and the blood on the floor. It was clear that something violent had taken place. Sarah knew she couldn't clean it up. There was no way to hide what had happened. She had to face it. She decided to call the police. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone, dialing the local emergency number. When the operator answered, Sarah's voice was shaky, but she forced herself to stay calm as she explained that there had been an accident, that her husband was dead, and that she needed help. The words felt surreal as they left her mouth. Within minutes, sirens filled the air outside the hotel. Sarah stood by the door, waiting for the inevitable knock. When the police arrived, she opened the door slowly, her face pale and emotionless. They entered the room cautiously, their eyes immediately going to David's body on the floor. Sarah was led out of the room and down to the hotel lobby, where she was asked to sit and wait. The scene in the hotel room was chaotic. Officers moved in and out, taking photos, examining the evidence, and talking quietly among themselves. Detective James Monroe arrived shortly after, a seasoned officer who had seen more than his share of violent crimes. He took charge of the situation, quickly assessing what had taken place. Sarah sat in silence, her mind numb. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew that her life had just changed forever. The honeymoon was over, and now she was left to face the consequences of a crime that she had never meant to commit. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was dead because of her. And there was no going back. As Sarah sat in the hotel lobby, waiting for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. The police were upstairs, piecing together the scene, while she remained in shock. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. It had been an accident. That's what she kept telling herself. But would anyone believe her? The violence had escalated so quickly, and now David was dead. Sarah could hardly grasp how everything had spiraled out of control so fast. Detective James Monroe, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp instincts, had arrived to take charge of the case. After surveying the crime scene, he knew this wasn't just a simple domestic dispute gone wrong. Something deeper was going on. He reviewed the evidence meticulously, paying attention to every detail: the overturned furniture, the blood-stained lamp, and Sarah's shaken demeanor. The detectives took Sarah in for questioning, and she found herself in a cold, dimly lit room at the local police station. Her hands trembled as she recounted the events of the evening, explaining how everything had escalated from a heated argument to a fatal confrontation. She described how David had revealed his secrets, how the lies had shattered her trust, and how, in a moment of fear, she had grabbed the lamp to defend herself. Every word she spoke felt heavy, as if she was reliving the nightmare over and over again. Detective Monroe listened carefully. While Sarah's story matched the physical evidence, he knew that intent mattered just as much as the facts. Was this truly an act of self-defense, or was there more to the story? The investigation had to dig deeper into David's past and the couple's relationship. As Monroe looked into David's life, he uncovered a history of manipulation and deceit. David had been living a double life, using Sarah for her wealth while maintaining relationships with other women. He had racked up debts, made false promises, and had left a trail of lies in his wake. But the detective also needed to determine if Sarah had been aware of David's darker side all along. The media quickly picked up on the case. A wealthy couple's honeymoon turned deadly. This was the kind of headline that would capture public attention. Reporters flocked to the small town, speculating on what had really happened. Was Sarah the victim, or was she hiding something? The courtroom drama that followed became a spectacle, with both sides presenting their version of the tragic events. Sarah's defense team argued that she had acted in self-defense. They highlighted David's history of deceit and his violent outburst during the argument. The defense painted a picture of a woman who had been pushed to the brink, who had no choice but to defend herself in a moment of desperation. They called on witnesses, including friends who testified about David's controlling behavior and the tension that had been brewing between the couple even before the honeymoon. On the other side, the prosecution argued that Sarah had acted out of anger. They claimed that she had lashed out in a fit of rage when she discovered David's infidelity, and that the blow with the lamp had been intentional, not accidental. The prosecution emphasized the violent nature of the attack, suggesting that Sarah had wanted revenge for the betrayal she had suffered. The trial stretched on for weeks, with emotions running high on both sides. The courtroom was filled with spectators, all eager to see how the story would unfold. As the evidence was presented, the jury listened intently. They had to decide whether Sarah was telling the truth about acting in self-defense, or if she had committed murder in a moment of anger. Detective Monroe's testimony was critical. He laid out the evidence clearly and objectively, presenting both the physical facts of the crime scene and the background information he had uncovered about David's life. His professional assessment helped shape the narrative of the case, but ultimately it was up to the jury to decide. After days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to read the decision. Sarah sat nervously, her heart pounding in her chest. She had already lost so much: her husband, her future, her sense of security, and now everything hinged on this moment. The jury found Sarah guilty of manslaughter, not premeditated murder. They believed that she had not planned to kill David, but that her actions had been reckless in the heat of the moment. Sarah was sentenced to several years in prison, a fate that weighed heavily on her as she was led away in handcuffs. The story of Sarah and David ended in tragedy, a cautionary tale of love, betrayal, and violence. The aftermath of the case left a lasting impact on those who had followed the trial. Some believed Sarah had been the victim of a manipulative man and had done what she had to in order to protect herself. Others saw her as someone who had allowed her emotions to drive her to a fatal decision. In the end, the truth of what really happened in that hotel room may never be fully known. But what was clear to everyone was that a marriage built on lies, secrets, and deception could only lead to disaster.